Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at the book of Second Samuel in our continuing survey of the Old Testament. First and Second Samuel were originally written as one continuous book, but for brevity's sake, we've divided them up so that we can handle them better into two different books, First and Second Samuel. First Samuel was the rise and fall of Saul, although you don't see him until around chapter 8 or 9, 10. Second Samuel is going to be the rise and fall of David and his kingship. So in First Samuel, we started off introducing Samuel first, his birth, and then the Ark of the Covenant, how it had been captured by the Philistines, went on its adventures, but eventually was brought back. And then we have Saul himself, chosen to be king. And in chapters 8 through 15, we see his rise to power. The good things that he does, the things that he does not so good. And in chapter 15, he disobeys God and is rejected by Samuel. Saul is rejected, and Samuel says, "That's it. I'm going to go to someone else. Someone else will become king in your place. The kingdom is going to be taken from you and given to your neighbor." And so he goes from there and chooses David, young David, to be the next king. But David doesn't become king right now. Initially, he fights Goliath, and he begins serving as within Saul's army. And then Saul becomes jealous, and David becomes a fugitive, and that took us all the way up to chapter 30 and 31, where Saul is killed by the Philistines. So Saul dies at the end of First Samuel. As Second Samuel opens up, David now is going to be king, initially just king of the tribe of Judah, but eventually he's going to be king of all of Israel. And so that's the rise of David, the first 10 chapters. And then chapters 11 through 20 are David's family troubles, the David and Bathsheba incident, David's problems with his own children, other rebellions. And then chapters 21 through 24 are a group, like an assortment of stories and songs and sayings, not necessarily in chronological order, but about David and his reign. So David becomes king after the death of Saul, but initially he's only king of one little tribe. The tribe of Judah recognizes his leadership, not the rest of Israel. And so he really, at this time, we call him king, but he's really more of a tribal elder. And he's ruling from the city of Hebron. That's right in the middle of Judah. And the other tribes are following one of the surviving sons of Saul, the person of Ishbosheth, who really, let me just face it, is not quite up to the task. He has an advisor by the name of Abner, and as long as Abner's running things, it goes okay. And that goes on for about 7 years. And then after 7 years, Ishbosheth is pushed out of the way. Abner himself is killed. And now the other tribes come under David's leadership, so he will be king over all of Israel, both Judah and the nation of Israel. Now, he's going to look for a new capital. Having his capital in Hebron won't work very well. So he's going to choose a Canaanite city, the city of Jerusalem. Notice on our map that it's right sort of on the border. It's not actually in Judah. It's not actually in Benjamin, which would be just to the north. It's not in Ephraim. It's a border city. A little bit like Washington, D.C., the city in which I was born. I was born in D.C., and it's between Maryland and Virginia, but it's not in any actual state of the United States. That's why they call it D.C., the District of Columbia. Well, the same thing with Jerusalem. I want to look up at Jerusalem. We're looking at a topographical layout with the current walls that you see date back to the Muslim period. That's what you're seeing superimposed here. You notice on the right-hand side, you can see looks like several squares. That's the Temple Mount. But the original city, going back to David's day, is this outline area on this big narrow ridge. It was quite long and relatively narrow upon that ridge, so that on the east, south, and west sides there were steep ravines on those sides. To the north there was a higher area, but we now know that someone, whether it was the Jews or maybe the Canaanites before them, had cut a trench across that northern part to make that uphill as well. What I like to suggest is if you take your right hand and point the fingers down toward the ground, and let your now you have to do this where you're looking at the top of your hand. Notice how your thumb becomes a sort of a do-it-yourself map of the ancient city of Jerusalem back in David's day. Later on, the Jerusalem is going to spread out throughout the rest of that area, but this suffices for now. And as you trace that area around your hand, that's the area that are all ravines, these steep valleys on the east, the south, and the west side. To the north, notice that's the rest of your wrist and the rest of your hand leading up your arm. And that works nicely because to the north were higher grounds. Now, 2 Samuel chapter 5, beginning in verse 8, notice David said on that day, whoever would strike the Jebusites, this was a Jebusite city, and the Israelites, David had come up to the city, and the Jebusites took the attitude, there's no way that you can fight your way up to us. First of all, we're surrounded on three sides, and then there's that deep ditch that we've dug on the north side. There's mountains all around us, and then you climb to the top of the mountain, then there's a city wall. And so David says, whoever would strike the Jebusite, let him reach. And notice they were calling themselves the lame and the blind. Even if we were lame and blind, you couldn't break through our walls. And so he says this sort of tongue in cheek, let him reach the lame and the blind who are hated by David's soul through the water tunnel. And that reference to the water tunnel was read back in the 1800s. A British captain by the name of Charles Warren, 1867, and he went looking for the tunnel that is referenced there in 2 Samuel. And he found one. There's a place on the east side of the city called the Gihon Spring, and he found a tunnel there leading under the mountain, and then there was a shaft going almost straight up that that brought the person, the climber, and in his day he had to do some serious climbing to get there. He climbed up the shaft and found that it led out behind the city walls, and apparently David's people used this to capture the city. You can go to that shaft today. Now, you don't have to do too much climbing today. Today they have a nice, easy set of stairs, but you can actually go through that shaft and go up under the walls as they were back in that day. Here's a artist's conception of what the city looked like. Notice how it's very long and relatively narrow, built upon a ridge on the east side, which is the Kidron Valley. On the west side was what's later became known as the Tyropoeon Valley. Not sure it had that name back in David's day. And then to notice to the north, there's high ground. Eventually, in the days of Solomon, he's going to build a temple there, but that wasn't there yet in David's day. Now, David has captured the city and he makes it his capital, and now he decides to bring the Ark of the Covenant. Remember how the Ark had been captured by the Philistines and all sorts of bad things had happened in the Philistine city, so they had released it, they had put it in a cart with oxen and turned it back home. And so now David decides he's going to bring the Ark home, not to where the tabernacle is, but to Jerusalem, where it will stay there. And so we read 2 Samuel chapter 6, verse 3. They placed the Ark of the Covenant on a new cart. The Philistines had placed it on a cart years before, but now this is a new cart that they might bring it from the house of Abinadab, which was on the hill. And Uzzah and Ahio, the sons of Abinadab, were leading the new cart. So here they are bringing it up to Jerusalem. But when they came to the threshing floor of Nacon, Uzzah reached out toward the ark of God and took hold of it, for the oxen nearly upset it. He didn't want to see the ark bouncing down the hill, and so he reached out to grab it and steady it. And when he did that, you weren't supposed to be touching the ark. So we read that the anger of the Lord burned against Uzzah, and the Lord struck him down there for his irreverence, and he died there by the Ark of the Covenant. The point is that God wants to be taken seriously, very, very seriously. David became angry because of the Lord's, and notice that term, the Lord's outburst against Uzzah. The term outburst is paraz, and that place is called Perez. It's called Perez Uzzah to this day. It's a play on words there. Verse 10, and David was unwilling to move the ark of the Lord into the city of David with him, but David took it aside to the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite. Thus the ark of the Lord remained in the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite for 3 months, and the Lord blessed Obed-Edom and all his household. He hadn't done anything. He was treating the ark reverently. So verse 12, now it was told King David, saying, the Lord has blessed the house of Obed-Edom and all that belongs to him on account of the ark of God. David went and brought up the ark of God from the house of Obed-Edom into the city of David with gladness. And so there's great celebration, and they bring the ark into the city of David, into the city of Jerusalem. And Second Samuel tells the story of David dancing before the Lord. In fact, I don't know if it was a warm day or what time of year it was, but he took off the bulk of his clothes and was dancing before the Lord. And his wife, Michal, remember that's the daughter of Saul. Saul's died, but Michal is still married to David. She sees this and she gets very upset. She tells David later on, you were supposed to be acting like a king. You didn't look very kingly. And David says, I was worshiping the bigger king. I was worshiping God. And they sort of have it. Now, they don't get divorced or anything like that, but he no longer sleeps with her, and she will not have any children, and she will die with no children. And that in that culture was not considered a good thing. After this, we're going to read about the David and Bathsheba incident, and I'm sure you're familiar with that, where David happens to see another man's wife. She is bathing on the roof. Not sure if that was a normal thing or not, but it happened. And he sees her and he asks about her. He finds out that she's married, but he determines to have her, and so he calls her and sends for her, and she comes, and they actually come together sexually. So he commits adultery with her. And then sometime later, she sends a message, by the way, I'm pregnant now, and the baby is yours. And so David sends for the husband, Uriah the Hittite, and Uriah is off with David's army fighting a campaign on the other side of the Jordan, but he comes back now, and David attempts to hide the sin. What he does is he says, Uriah, take the night off, go home and be with your wife. And Uriah says, my people, my soldiers aren't able to be with their wives. And so I'm going to express my solidarity with them. I'm not going to do it. And David's attempt fails. I'm not entirely certain. Did Uriah, was he just being noble? I think he was being noble. Or did he also maybe have some suspicions? Maybe he had heard some things and he's not going to play along. I don't know what's going on in Uriah's heart, but I know what's going on in David's heart. He's trying to cover up. And when the cover up doesn't work, now he plots Uriah's death, and he sends a message to his main commander. Joab was his relative. I'm not sure if it was a cousin or nephew, but he sends word to Joab, put Uriah in the front lines and go in and attack, and then at a given signal, retreat and just leave Uriah hanging out there. Well, that's really murder. He's plotting to have Uriah killed, and he does that. And sure enough, it works. Uriah is killed. And now David takes Uriah's widow, Bathsheba, and takes her and marries her, so that it will look like the child that is born is now the product of their marriage. Sure enough, the child is born, and David thinks, I've gotten away with it. But now Nathan the prophet comes to him and tells him a story about a poor man and a rich man that both lived within David's kingdom, and how the poor man had a little lamb that was just like a member of the family, and the rich man went and took that poor man's lamb and killed it, and when the poor man objected, the rich man had the poor man killed. And David is hearing this story. Of course, he's not told it's a pretend story. He's not told it's a parable. He's hearing this story, and he becomes enraged. And he says, that man, that rich man, ought to die. And Nathan points to him and says, you are the man. And David realizes that he's been caught out. he was acting like a pagan king, but he's Israelite. He's not supposed to be acting like a pagan king. That's no excuse. And so David repents. And Nathan says, because of your sin, you're going to be allowed to continue as king. But this newborn son that came from Bathsheba, that son is going to die. And David begins to pray, and he fasts, and he weeps, and he's seeking that maybe God will change his mind. And the child dies. And when the child dies, David, recognizing that he recognizes that's the justice of God, and I thought maybe that God might change his mind, but he didn't. And so that's sort of over and done with. We're going to come back and talk about that as it relates to prophecy when we get to the prophets. So hold that story in mind. Now, and Bathsheba is eventually going to have another son. That's going to be Solomon, and Solomon isn't the one that died. That's an unnamed son that died. And I put here just a few of David's wives and just a few of his children by those wives. There are a number of others. But in this case, I want you to see the story that develops in the next few chapters, where he has one son by the name of Amnon, the son of Ahinoam, one of the wives of David. And notice these are half brothers and half sisters to each other. And then there's Absalom and Tamar, who are full brother and sister by another mother. And Amnon happens to be watching his half sister Tamar, and he begins to lust after her. Reminds me a little bit about how David lusted after Bathsheba. And so Amnon is lusting after her, and he is just wanting her so bad. And remember Joab? I mentioned Joab, the military commander under David. Joab actually concocts a plan, and Amnon follows the plan where he pretends to be sick and asks that Tamar might come and tend to him. And while she is doing that, he forcibly takes her and rapes her. And then when he's done, he basically throws her out. It was a matter where he fulfilled his lust and now wanted nothing to do with her. And she says, raping me was bad, but just throwing me out now, that's even worse. And David hears about it, and David said, you really shouldn't have done that, naughty, but there's no punishment. And Absalom is so angry, both with Amnon, but also with David, because David, his father, their father, didn't do anything about it, just let it happen. And so Absalom plots his revenge, and he waits for months and a year and another year. And finally, he throws a party. He doesn't let anybody know that he's planning this. He throws a party and invites Amnon. He actually invites David too, but David doesn't show up. And at the party, Absalom has Amnon murdered, has his own half-brother murdered. Well, this family is very, this isn't working at all. It's a very dysfunctional family. And so we have David's sin being repeated. Notice how he lusts for Bathsheba, the wife of Uriah. Amnon lusts for Tamar, his half-sister. And David had sent for Bathsheba and committed adultery with her. And Amnon pretended to be sick and then raped Tamar. And David secretly plotted to have Uriah put to death. And Absalom plots and carries the plot out, murders his half-brother Amnon. And so at this point, Absalom then, he is banished from the land. He has to go live in some other place. And after quite a long time, he is eventually allowed to come back. But when he is allowed to return, he's not initially reconciled to David. David doesn't come in and see him, and there's no real forgiveness. There's no reconciliation. And eventually there is some of that, but now Absalom is so angry with David that he begins to plot a rebellion, and he doesn't really do this in secret. It's almost like he's running for public office. He goes down to Hebron, and he sort of ferments this whole dissatisfaction. You would get a much better hearing. I know what it's like, he would tell people. I know what it's like to be ignored by the king. And yes, you've got legitimate problems. And if I were your king, then I would listen to you. But David, he won't listen to anyone. And so he stirs up this revolt until finally it's obvious that everyone's going to vote for Absalom, except they're not going to have an election. They're going to turn to him, and there's going to be a revolution. And so David is forced to flee from Jerusalem. It's at this point that we have this description of David leaving the city and going up the Mount of Olives to the east of the city. And he's walking up to the top and he's weeping. The high priest actually wants to bring the Ark of the Covenant. They bring out the Ark, and David says, no, I'm not going to play games with the Ark of the Covenant. Maybe I will one day be allowed to come back to Jerusalem, but I'm not going to take the Ark into this situation where they're going to be banished from the land. God stays in the city. Maybe I can come back, and we'll see how that happens. He gets to the top of the Mount of Olives. Notice chapter 15, verse 30. As David went up the ascent of the Mount of Olives and wept as he went, and his head was covered, and he walked barefoot. He's in mourning, weeping over the city. And it's striking that 1,000 years later, the greater son of David, Jesus, would present himself in the temple in Jerusalem. Notice you can see the Dome of the Rock where it is now. That's where the temple once was back in Jesus' day. And then he left the temple when he was rejected by the leaders, the Jewish leaders. And he went up to the top of the mountain where we're standing here taking this picture, and he wept over the city, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, how often I wanted to gather you together as a hen gathers her chicks, but you would not come. And so here's David doing that. We're going to see one other place where something goes to the top of the Mount of Olives too, when we get to Ezekiel, but I'm not going to give that away quite yet. Now, David had two counselors, one who had turned against him. That was Ahithophel. You say, why did Ahithophel turn against him? Well, when I look up Ahithophel and look up every reference to him, I find that the grandfather of Bathsheba was also named Ahithophel. And if it's the same person, and I think it is, then you might understand where the grandfather of Bathsheba was not very happy with David over what he had done in the past. And so he's going to cast his lot in with Absalom. David has another advisor by the name of Hushai. And Hushai wants to come with David, but David said, no, you can best serve me by staying behind and pretending to be a counselor to Absalom. And so Absalom is going to inherit both of these counselors. Now, Absalom comes to the city, and it basically falls to him very easily. He doesn't have to fight for it. And the first thing that he does is he takes David's concubines in the presence of everyone and takes them as though they were his own wives, as if to say, I've taken his harem, I've taken his family, they all belong to me. I'm going to do physically what I want with them in a sexual way. This is not a pretty picture. And now Ahithophel and Hushai both come to Absalom with different plans. And Ahithophel says, David is very weak right now. He only had a handful of people leave with him. If you chase him down and catch him, you will win. And Hushai says, that's not a good idea. After all, Saul chased David all over the place, and that didn't work. What you ought to do is stay here, consolidate your power, and then at the right season, you can follow and catch up with him and defeat him, but you will do so from a position of strength. And of course, Hushai was an undercover agent. He was doing exactly what David wanted. And not only David, but we read in chapter 17, verse 14, that the Lord had ordained to thwart the counsel of Ahithophel. And so Ahithophel, when seeing that his counsel isn't being followed, he goes home and commits suicide because he can already see David's going to win this. And when David wins this, then the enemies of David are going to be in deep trouble. Now, Absalom eventually does consolidate his power, and he comes after David. But David, by this time, has grown powerful, has gathered forces, especially on the east side of the Jordan. And so when they do enter into battle, Absalom not only loses, but as he is running away as he is retreating. His long, long flowing hair gets caught in the branches of a tree, and suddenly he finds himself, he had been riding an animal, and all of a sudden he's hanging there. And Joab, remember Joab? Joab comes along and kills him. Now, David had actually left orders. I want my son Absalom to survive this battle. Yes, he was a rebel, but I don't want to kill him. This is my son. And David is heartbroken, but Absalom dies there. So we have in 2 Samuel, notice we saw David as king. We saw the family troubles of David, and that's only the first of several revolts. There's another revolt that takes place after that, not led by a family member, but still, it's a dangerous revolt. And we come all the way to the end of chapter 20, and we get to chapter 21 through 24. And now we have several other stories and reflections and poems and things like that, all of David. So let's look at that. In chapter 21, we have David's intercessory prayer in the midst of a famine, where David prays on behalf of the people and the nation. Next, there is a listing of the accomplishments of David's giant killers. You say, well, how big were these giants? I think they were a little bit larger than usual people. Some very, very big people. No, they weren't 20 feet tall, anything like that, but still, they were large. And some of their accomplishments are listed. Next, we have David's song of praise in chapter 22. We have his words of praise in chapter 23, verses 1 through 7. And then we have the accomplishments of some of David's mighty men. And there's really some cool stories there. You ought to go read that. And one particular that I particularly like, about a battle that had taken place in the vicinity of Bethlehem. And it's a great story. But what I want to look at is the last story, the last narrative, is David's intercessory prayer in the midst of a plague. That's going to be in chapter 24. So let's look at that chapter. 2 Samuel 24:1. Now again, the anger of the Lord burned against Israel, and it incited David against them to say, go number Israel and Judah. The king said to Joab, the the commander of the army who was with him, go about now through all of the tribes of Israel, from Dan even to Beersheba, from one end of the south to the other, and register the people, that I may know the number of the people. You say, what's wrong with that? Well, remember the promise to Abraham had been that I'm going to make a nation that no one can number. Well, if they're going to number the people, then it can be numbered. So it's almost a denial of that promise. And Joab, remember Joab? Joab seems to be in it for himself, but in this case, he actually gives some good advice. But Joab said to the king, now may the Lord your God add to the people 100 times as many as they are, while the eyes of my lord the king still see. But why does my lord the king delight in this thing? Joab gives a hint. This is a bad idea, but David's going to do it anyway, and because David commands it, Joab carries it out. Now, we have this chapter then. We start off in verse 1 with the Lord's anger, and then David commands the census. Joab tries to dissuade him, but obeys his command. Next, we see David repenting. He realizes that his actions have been rather arrogant, have not kept in mind the promises of God with regard to what the nation will be. He repents before God, and the Lord sends a prophet by the name of Gad. We haven't seen Gad the prophet yet, but Gad tells David that he can choose which punishment that will be dispensed because of David's actions. Because of David's actions, there's going to be a punishment, and a lot of other people are going to suffer, not just David. And so he has one of three choices. He can have 7 years of famine. Reminds me of the Joseph story. He can flee 3 months before the enemies, before his own enemies and the enemies of Israel, or he can have 3 days pestilence. And David says, let me not fall into the hands of those outsiders. Let me fall into the hands of the Lord. So David chooses the hand of the Lord, and this is the pivotal point in the story. Next, we see that the pestilence comes, and when it comes, it seems to be so visible that you can almost see where it's hitting. This is not something where you catch the disease and a week later you start to develop a cough and then you get sick and die. This is happening very, very fast, almost supernaturally fast. A pestilence upon the people, and it's coming down from the north, and you can see it coming toward Jerusalem, and it's going to take out Jerusalem. And David stands up and he says, "Take me instead." He offers himself instead of the city, that he might die in place of the city. He offers himself as a substitute. Well, as a result, God stops the plague right there. Now, he doesn't kill David, but he stops the plague. And David determines to, he actually goes to Araunah. Is that a title or a name? I'm not entirely sure. But he goes to this person, Araunah, who owned the plot of land just north of the city of Jerusalem, where there was a threshing floor. Threshing floor is a big area, sort of high, where there's a lot of wind, because you take your grain, grind it, and throw it up in the air, and let the wheat and the chaff divide from each other. Well, Araunah offers the threshing floor to be used for worship, and David says, "No, I'm not going to give something to the Lord that did not cost me." And so David pays the price for the threshing floor. Now, it's significant that he pays the price, because that's eventually going to be where the temple will be built, will be on that threshing floor, the high place on that mountain just north of the old David city of Jerusalem. Next, David offers a sacrifice, built an altar, offers a sacrifice to the Lord in thanksgiving for having spared the city. And the chapter ends where the Lord is moved by David's action, by his repentance, by his sacrifice. But before we close, we have to note that David's offer of himself as a substitute is exactly what we see in the greater David, the eventual son of David, and I'm speaking, of course, of Jesus, who also died in Jerusalem, also died outside the city gates. Now, he didn't die on the Temple Mount, because by that time that was within the city gates, but he died, he was crucified for us, so that he really could say, "Take me instead." And if you trust in him as your Lord and Savior, then you find out that he is your substitute as well.